Chapter 1. The Proctor arrives on a quiet day. The last arbitrator they sent to Gunmetal City filed a single report before going silent. The report contained one sentence. It read, "The city is compliant. He was never found." Senior Proctor Corthane read that sentence 11 times on the transport descent, feeling the weight of the craft push against him as the atmosphere thickened below. He had read it first 3 weeks ago when his assignment came through. He had read it again on the shuttle from the orbital station. He was reading it now, and each time he read it the sentence became stranger, not in its content, but in its confidence. Compliant. The word a man chooses when everything is satisfactory. The word you write when there is nothing left to investigate. Not resolved. No situation was assessed. Compliant. As if the city had been checked against a standard and found to meet it. As if the city had been graded. The man who wrote it had been a senior proctor with 19 years of service. His name was Harren Voss. He had survived the Sump riots on Hive Primus, had single-handedly broken a smuggling cartel that had operated for 3 decades inside the Administratum's own courier network, had been commended 4 times for thoroughness under pressure. 19 years. 1 sentence. Gone. Corthane tucked the data slate into his coat and looked out the viewport. Gunmetal City rose to meet him through a permanent ceiling of forge smoke. Not the grey-brown haze of pollution, but something denser and more deliberate. A deep amber black that caught the planet's light and held it, turning the sky above the Hive into something that looked almost like a bruise that couldn't heal. He had read about this too. The forge smoke of Gunmetal City was legendary, as famous as the city's walls or its weapons. 342 years ago, a poet-scribe of the Administratum had called it the city's crown. The phrase had entered the vernacular. People here were proud of that sky. Corthane watched it and felt for the first time the faint unease he would spend the next several weeks trying to name. The city was producing. Even from altitude he could see it. The vast forge stacks running at full output, their rhythmic exhalations contributing in real time to that amber ceiling. He pulled up the preliminary intake report on his slate. Gunmetal City was currently operating at 114% of its standard production quota. Weapons, ammunition, void munitions, las packs, fragmentation casings. The specifics ran down the page like a hymn to industry. Everything the Imperium needed and asked for, delivered ahead of schedule, above target, without complaint. He had been sent here because of a civil disturbance in the upper Hive. 73 workers, simultaneously, without coordination or prior communication, had stopped working, sat down on the floor of an Administratum processing block, and remained there for 11 hours. They had not been violent. They had not been agitated. They had been, according to the attending medica's report, calm, not sedated, not catatonic, calm. The kind of calm that people sometimes describe after a religious experience, or a very bad dream they can't quite remember, or the moment following an event so large they have no framework to process it yet. The medici had written, patients display effects consistent with profound but unspecified revelation. 11 hours. Then they had stood up, returned to their stations, and resumed work. Every single one. No explanation offered. No charges filed. No repeat occurrence in the 6 weeks since. The disturbance had been flagged to the Arbite's relay as a matter of routine. The relay had sent Corthane. He was aware, descending through that amber sky toward a city that was famous for not breaking, that the investigation seemed routine. He was aware that the productive output metrics suggested a Hive functioning not merely normally, but exceptionally. He was aware that the disturbance was minor, contained, and apparently resolved. He was also aware that Harren Voss had found the city compliant and subsequently ceased to exist. The landing pad assigned to him was on the upper Hive's outer transit tier, a wide, heat-blasted platform that smelled of promethium and hot metal. The smell hit him before the ramp was fully lowered. Not unpleasant, not sharp, simply total. A smell that didn't compete with other smells because there were no other smells. The air of Gunmetal City tasted of the Forge so completely that the Forge seemed less like something the city did and more like something the city was. Enforcer Captain Vaskan Drail was waiting at the platform's edge with 2 officers flanking him. He was a compact man in his early 50s, broad through the shoulders, with the careful stillness of someone who had spent a long time in a position of local authority and had learned that movement invited questions. His uniform was immaculate. His handshake was firm. His eyes, when they met Corthane's, were precise and professionally warm and never stopped moving. Not nervously, not evasively, but with the steady peripheral alertness of a man monitoring multiple things simultaneously, like a forge worker who has learned to track a dozen gauges at once. Senior Proctor, welcome to Gunmetal City. A brief pause in which he seemed to consider and then decide against something. We're grateful for your attention to this matter. Grateful for your attention. Corthane filed the phrasing. Not glad you're here. Now we've been waiting. Grateful for your attention, as if the matter were a mildly interesting administrative question that deserved a thoughtful response, rather than an urgent investigation requiring immediate action. The workers who were affected, Corthane said. Are they available to be interviewed? Of course. No hesitation. All 73 have returned to full duty. We've kept them accessible per standard protocol. You'll find them cooperative. Another micro pause. They're good workers, all of them. Long service records. Corthane noted the sequencing. Cooperative first. Good workers second. As if the most important thing to establish about the witnesses was their productivity rating. The briefing took place in a small conference room on the transit tier's administrative level. It was thorough. It was detailed. It answered every question Corthane had prepared, and several he hadn't thought to ask. Drail presented it with the ease of someone who had given this briefing before. Not this specific briefing, but briefings of this type to people of this rank, about situations requiring this precise level of managed disclosure. The medical assessments were there, the timeline was clear, the containment response had been swift and proportionate. 40 minutes in, Corthane realized what was missing. He reviewed his notes to confirm it, then said, Your predecessor's report, Arbitrator Voss's assessment from 14 months ago. I'd like to review it. The room's temperature didn't change. Drail's expression didn't change, but something in the quality of his stillness shifted, almost imperceptibly, the way a piece of metal shifts when you apply load to it, not deforming, just communicating the presence of stress. Of course, Drail said. I'll have it pulled from the archive, though I should note, his assignment was brief. His assessment was that the city presented no significant compliance concerns. Yes, Corthane said. I've read his summary. He let the silence sit for a moment. I'd like to see the full report. Naturally. Drail made a note. His pen moved with the deliberate calm of a man writing something he had written before. I'll have it sent to your billet. It was not sent to his billet. Not that evening, not the next morning. When Corthane followed up through the formal request channel, he received an acknowledgement within the hour. Prompt, courteous, apologetic. There had been an archiving inconsistency. The full report was being located. He would have it shortly. He interviewed the workers instead, all 73. 2.5 days of interviews. He had not planned to interview all of them. A representative sample would have been sufficient for a preliminary assessment. But by the third interview, he understood that he needed all of them, because the pattern was in the accumulation rather than the individual accounts. Each worker remembered the moment of sitting down differently. The stimulus was different for each person. A sound, a sensation, a quality of light through a viewport, a smell from the forge vents. The trigger was never the same, but the experience that followed was consistent across all 73, with an exactness that should have been statistically impossible. Every one of them described a feeling of sudden, overwhelming coherence. Not peace, not quite. Something more precise than peace. The specific feeling of a question being answered, a question they hadn't known they were asking. When Corthane pressed them, what question? What was answered? They all used the same language. Not the same words, but the same shape of words. The same reaching for something just out of reach. The closest any of them came was a woman on the third day, a munitions press operator with 22 years of service, and a daughter who worked 2 levels below her. She thought about it for a long time, hands folded on the table, and then said, "It was like, you know how you can work somewhere for years and never think about why the work matters? You just do it because it's the work, because it's always been the work. And then for a moment, you understood exactly why. Not the imperial reason, not the production quota reason, the real reason, the reason underneath all the other reasons. And it made complete sense." She paused. "I can't tell you what the reason was. I've tried to remember. I can't get back to it. But while I was sitting there, I wasn't afraid. I wasn't confused. Everything was exactly the right size. Everything was exactly the right size." Corthane wrote it down. He wrote down all of it. 73 accounts. The same shape of experience, 73 different surfaces. By the time he finished, the forge smoke sky outside his billet viewport had cycled through 3 amber shifts, and the city below him had not slowed for a single hour. On the evening of the 4th day, alone in his billet with his notes arranged across the floor in the pattern he used when he was trying to find the architecture of something, the shape beneath the surface of a case, he pulled up Harren Voss's personnel file again. He had looked at it before. He looked at it again now because of something the munitions press operator had said. The real reason. The reason underneath all the other reasons. Voss's assignment to Gunmetal City was dated 16 months ago. His summary report, the single sentence, the word compliant, was dated 14 months ago. 2 months between arrival and report. Standard for a preliminary assessment. But the summary report's transmission metadata showed a dispatch timestamp from a relay beacon in the outer transit tier. Corthane pulled the beacon's activity log, which he had requisitioned as part of his standard evidence intake on day 1, and which no one had thought to withhold, because no one had anticipated he would look at it. The beacon's log showed the report transmitted 14 months ago. It also showed Voss's personnel locator, a standard Arbeits tracking signal, passive, always active, going dark inside the city 7 months before the report was transmitted. 7 months. Harren Voss had been unlocatable inside Gunmetal City for 7 months before he filed the report that said everything was compliant. The city had his report. The Imperium had filed it. Corthane was holding it. The report had been filed 6 months after the man who wrote it had disappeared. Outside, the forges ran on. The amber sky held its light. Somewhere below him, in the deep rhythmic dark of the production levels, something was being made, endlessly, perfectly, ahead of schedule. And Corthane sat very still in his billet with the lights on, and the door locked, and the specific feeling of a floor that had been solid an hour ago, and was now, he understood, something else entirely. He did not sleep. In the morning, he requested Voss's full archive report again. The response came back within the hour. apologetic, courteous. They were still locating it. He filed a note in his own case record. The city is cooperative. The city is helpful. The city has not refused a single request. It simply hasn't fulfilled them. There is a difference. I am only now learning to see it. Chapter 2. Everything functions as intended. Corthane would later calculate that he had spoken to 41 people in his first 3 days in Gunmetal City. Not one of them had asked him a single question. Not about his investigation. Not about where he came from. Not about anything at all. They had answered. They had deferred. They had performed the full theater of cooperation. Doors opened, records offered, schedules cleared. But not one of them had been curious about him. Not one had asked how long he planned to stay, or what his methodology was, or whether he needed anything beyond what had already been provided. They simply responded, efficiently and warmly, to whatever he directed at them, and then waited for the next direction. He noticed it on day 5. He tested it on day 6. On day 7, he sat across from the city's senior guild registrar, a man named Holt, 3rd generation in his position, whose father and grandfather had occupied the same office, and deliberately let a silence stretch to 40 seconds after his last question was answered. 40 seconds in an interview room is a geological age. Most people fill it. They elaborate, they qualify, they ask if there's anything else. They comment on the weather or the siege preparations or the quality of the recaf. Holt sat with his hands folded on the table and waited, pleasantly, with the patience of a man who had all the time in the world and no particular desire to spend any of it asking questions of his own. "You've been a guild registrar for how long?" Corthane said finally. 27 years, Holt said. "And before you, your father?" 22 years. Before him, my grandfather. 31. 80 years of continuous family oversight of guild records. Yes. A small, practiced smile. "We take the continuity of records seriously here. It's something the city values." "The city," Corthane said. "Not the guild. Not we. The city." Holt didn't blink. "The city, yes. Gunmetal City has always understood that its strength lies in its institutions. The guilds, the forges, the enforcers, each one maintaining its function, generation to generation, regardless of external pressure." He paused. "You'll find that's a common philosophy here. External pressure is not a new experience for us." "The siege preparations," Corthane said. "Yes, though we don't use that word yet. Officially." Another small smile. "Enhanced defensive posture. We've been in enhanced defensive posture before. The city knows what to do." Corthane looked at the founding charters he had requested. Originals, brought out with the careful reverence of religious texts, unrolled on the table between them. The guild charters of Gunmetal City predated its formal imperial integration by 211 years. He had flagged this in his notes. Most Hive institutions traced their legitimacy through imperial sanction. These predated it. He had asked Holt to explain the discrepancy. Holt had explained it for 12 minutes, fluently and thoroughly, and had answered every follow-up question Corthane raised. And by the end of those 12 minutes, Corthane understood the administrative history of the guild charters in complete detail, and had not learned a single thing about why they predated imperial integration. The explanation had been a room with no walls, infinitely navigable, utterly enclosed. He walked from the guild hall to the Mechanicus Annex in the mid-Hive transit corridor, a 20-minute route through passages that smelled alternately of hot iron and recycled air. The city around him was busy in the way that ancient machinery is busy, not frenetic, not urgent, but continuous. Workers moved with the unhurried efficiency of people whose relationship with their labor had long since passed the stage of effort and arrived at something closer to reflex. Nobody rushed. Nobody idled. The city produced the way a heart beats, not because it decided to, but because stopping was the thing that would require a decision. Magos Tertius Vren received him in a workspace that was more surgery than office. Surfaces of pale metal, instruments arranged with a precision that suggested not tidiness, but ritual. The smell of mechadendrite lubricant and something beneath it, older, like hot stone. Vren's augmentations were extensive. Perhaps 60% of the visible body was replaced. Arms entirely. The left side of the face a smooth metal plate with optical sensors where the eye had been. The voice, when it came from a Vox grill set into the throat, carrying the flat, scrubbed quality of sound, stripped of every frequency the Mechanicus deemed extraneous. Corthane had interviewed Mechanicus adepts before. Their effect was always modified. Emotion considered an inefficiency, small talk a waste of processing. He was prepared for a flat. What he was not prepared for was the specific quality of Vren's flatness, not the flatness of a mind restructured to value data over connection, but the flatness of a mind that had arrived somewhere and stopped moving. Not cold, not absent, settled. The production increased, Corthane said. 114% of the standard quota. You've been running at that level for 63 days. What's driving it? Atmospheric pressure, Vren said. Corthane waited. Increased atmospheric pressure in the lower forge levels creates optimal combustion conditions. Output increases as a natural consequence. What's causing the atmospheric pressure to increase? The forges. Corthane set his stylus down. The forges are increasing atmospheric pressure, which increases forge output, which increases atmospheric pressure. Yes. That's a closed loop. Yes. What initiated it? Vren's optical sensor adjusted. A small, precise movement, like a lens focusing. The city, Vren said, has its own equilibrium. Perturbations in one system create compensatory adjustments in others. This is the nature of a hive that has operated for 10,000 years. The systems have learned from each other. A pause so brief it might have been a processing delay. We find it more useful to observe these adjustments than to interrogate their origin. The origin is the city. The city is the origin. Corthane picked up his stylus. He wrote, "The city is the origin." He underlined it. He didn't know yet what it meant. He knew it meant something. He found Praetor Len Oswick 3 hours later, by accident, in the archive corridor of the Arbite's substation. A thin man in his late 30s, with the carefully managed appearance of someone who had been anxious for a long time and had learned to wear it quietly. Oswick had transferred to Gunmetal City from Hive to Menos 18 months ago. He was the only person Corthane had encountered since arriving who had come from somewhere else recently enough to still carry the somewhere else inside him. They recognized each other the way outsiders always do, not by appearance or rank, but by the quality of attention. The way they both looked at the same things. The slight pause before accepting what they were told. Oswick had been keeping notes. He produced them with the barely suppressed urgency of a man who had been waiting for someone to show them to. A thick data slate, entries dating back 14 months, written in the compressed shorthand of someone who had learned to document quickly and discreetly. I tried to submit a formal report, Oswick said. He had chosen a small storage room off the archive corridor. Not secretive, he explained, just quiet. Force of habit. 14 months ago. First one. I'd been here 4 months and something was... I couldn't name it yet, I still can't name it fully. But something was wrong in a way that didn't fit any category. So I wrote it down and submitted it through the standard channel. What happened? I was commended. He pulled up the formal commendation on his slate. It was warm, detailed, specific, praising his diligence, his thoroughness, his commitment to rigorous observation, signed by the substation commander. I thought, all right, they're taking it seriously, something will happen. Nothing happened. I waited 2 months and submitted again. Commended again? He showed Corthane the second commendation, then the third, then 4 more, each one filed at intervals across the 14 months, each one warmer and more detailed than the last, as if the quality of his concern were being rewarded in direct proportion to its persistence. 7 commendations. No action, no escalation, no response to any specific concern he had raised. They didn't dismiss me, Oswick said. He said it with the particular exhaustion of someone who had spent time understanding something they wished they hadn't. Dismissal would have meant I was wrong. They praised me, which meant I was right. I was doing exactly what a good enforcer should do, and it made absolutely no difference. I couldn't argue with a commendation. I couldn't appeal a commendation. They just absorbed it. Everything I reported, they absorbed it and said well done, and nothing moved. Corthane looked at the commendations. He had received one himself 4 days ago. He had thought nothing of it at the time. He thought something of it now. The workers who sat down, he said. You were here when it happened. I was 2 levels above. I felt it. Felt it. Oswick looked at him steadily. A vibration. Very low, very brief, like the city, exhaled. Then the alert came through about the workers. He paused. I've felt it twice before. Smaller. There are no instruments in this station calibrated to detect it. I checked. There should be. Standard Arbite substation equipment includes low-frequency resonance monitors for structural integrity purposes. This station's monitors were recalibrated 8 years ago, according to the maintenance log. Their sensitivity range was narrowed. Another pause. Nobody signed the recalibration order. It was logged as a routine maintenance update. There's no authorizing signature. Corthane was still writing. His hand had not stopped moving since Oswick began talking. Outside the substation, 3 hours later, the siege began. Not the announcement of a siege, the siege itself. The perimeter alarms were already sounding by the time the official notification reached the mid-Hive command channels. The Orc advance elements had made contact with the outer defense line at 4 simultaneous points, which was either extraordinary coordination for a or, as the tactical assessors were already carefully not saying in their preliminary reports, an approach vector that suggested someone had been watching the city's defensive patterns long enough to identify its seam lines. Corthane watched the response from the transit corridor viewport. It was the response that stayed with him afterward, more than the alarms, more than the distant concussion of the outer guns finding their range. The response was immediate. It was practiced. Every element of it, the forge reprioritization, the civilian movement orders, the enforcer deployment pattern, the guild supply chain activation, happened with the seamless precision of a mechanism engaging, not soldiers responding to a crisis. A city performing a function it had performed before and knew how to perform, and was, in some way he couldn't yet articulate, ready to perform. He stood at the viewport for a long time. The amber sky to the city's outer edge was beginning to show something different now. Darker, lower, the first suggestion of distant fire mixing with the forge smoke, the city's crown thickening. He pulled Gunmetal City's full siege history from the archive that night. It took him until the middle shift to locate all the records. Some were fragmented, some were reconstructed from secondary sources. But he found enough to count. 47 sieges across 10,000 years of recorded history. 47. The enemies varied across the full catalogue of the Imperium's nightmares. Orc incursions, chaos warbands, renegade PDF forces, 2 separate events classified only as Xeno's origin unclear, One entry so old its threat categorization used terminology that no longer existed in the Arbite's lexicon. Different enemies, different eras, different military technologies on both sides. The city had never fallen. This was known. This was the legend. He had carried the legend with him from his first briefing as a point of pride. A city the Imperium could rely on. An anchor in an unstable subsector. The forge that kept on forging. What was not in the legend was the duration data. He had to calculate it himself, because no one had assembled it in a single document, either because no one had thought to, or because no one had wanted to. He worked through the records siege by siege, logging start dates, end dates, durations. His hand slowed as the column filled. He stopped twice to recheck his calculations. He was not misreading. He was not making an arithmetic error. 47 sieges, 47 durations. The shortest was 14 months. The longest was 17 months and 3 weeks. Every single one across 10,000 years, across enemies with nothing in common except the city they had pressed against, between 14 and 17 months. The variance across 10 millennia was smaller than the variance in a single general's campaign planning estimates, as if the variable wasn't the enemy, as if the enemy's duration was being determined by something other than the enemy, as if something had decided how long each siege should last and communicated it, in whatever language it used, to 47 different armies across 47 different centuries, none of whom had any reason to listen to the same clock. Corthane put the data slate down on his billet table. He sat with his hands flat on the surface, feeling the faint vibration of the forges through the metal. That constant, deep, rhythmic presence he had stopped consciously noticing within his first day. The way you stop hearing traffic if you live near enough to it long enough. He was listening to it now. 14 months minimum, every time. He had been in the city 9 days. He did the arithmetic without meaning to. It arrived in his mind with the quiet certainty of a fact that has always been true and has only just been acknowledged. He had approximately 13 months and 3 weeks before whatever the city had decided would happen, happened. He opened a new case record entry. He titled it Duration Anomaly. He began to write. His notes were thorough, precise, completely without panic. The work of a man whose only available tool was documentation, and who had decided, with the deliberate calm of someone choosing a weapon in a confined space, to use it as well as it could possibly be used. He wrote for 2 hours. When he finished, he read back what he had written. Then he added a single final line to the entry, separate from the analysis, set apart by a space. The city is not defending itself. It is being fed. I don't yet know what it's hungry for. I think I will. He closed the file. He did not sleep. In the morning, he would go deeper. Chapter 3. What the lower levels remember. There is a level of Gunmetal City's underhive that does not appear on any official map. Corthane found 4 separate maps in the Arbite's archive, printed across 4 different centuries. On 3 of them, the level is present. A narrow designation, no name, just a depth marker and a single alphanumeric code, SB-0. On the most recent map, printed 40 years ago, the level is gone. Not collapsed, not sealed, not destroyed. Simply absent. The depth markers above and below it connecting cleanly, as if the space between them had never existed, as if someone had reached into the record and pinched 2 points together and pressed until the gap closed. A place that had been acknowledged for thousands of years, quietly, without ceremony, removed from official knowledge within living memory. Corthane stared at the 4 maps arranged side by side on his billet table for a long time. He was thinking about what it meant to unmake a place, not to destroy it. The level was still there, physically, he was certain of that, because you could not remove stone, but to remove it from the map, to excise it from the institutional record, to make it, in every documentable sense, not exist. This required consensus, not a single decision by a single authority, but a collective agreement across multiple institutions. The Mechanicus, the Arbeits Archive, the Guild Cartographers, the Administratum Survey Office, each one updating its own records to reflect the same absence, each one agreeing, separately or together, to forget the same thing. The effort required for that kind of coordinated forgetting was, in Corthane's experience, always proportional to what was being forgotten. He found Oswick before the midshift and showed him the maps without preamble. Oswick looked at them for 30 seconds, then looked at Corthane with the expression of a man who has been waiting for a specific conversation to begin and is not entirely glad it finally has. "I know where the access point is," Oswick said. He had found it 7 months ago. He had not gone in. He said this plainly, without apology. Not because he was afraid, he explained, but because going in alone had seemed like the kind of decision you don't come back from. Not necessarily physically, but in some other way he couldn't quantify, and he had wanted a witness before he made it. Corthane understood this. A witness was the only thing that made some acts of knowledge survivable. The knowledge that someone else also knew, that the things seen had been seen by more than one set of eyes, and therefore existed in a way that couldn't be entirely absorbed or managed or commended into silence. They requisitioned an enforcer guide through Drail's office. Standard procedure for Underhive access, nothing that would flag as unusual. The guide assigned to them was a man named Kale, 11 years on the lower level patrol circuit, who arrived at the transit point with the particular economy of movement that people develop when they have spent years navigating spaces that punish carelessness. He was neither hostile nor warm. He was present in the careful, minimal way of someone who had decided exactly how much of themselves this situation required, and was offering precisely that amount and no more. The descent took 40 minutes through maintenance corridors that grew progressively older as they went, the architecture shifting from the pressed metal utility of Imperial construction to something earlier, something that had been built over rather than replaced, the bones of older structures visible through gaps where newer paneling had buckled or corroded away. The smell changed too. Above, the city smelled of forge smoke and promethium, and the specific human mixture of 1 million bodies in close proximity to industry. Below, these smells thinned. What replaced them was older, a mineral cold, a dryness that had nothing to do with temperature, the smell of stone that had not moved in a very long time and had developed, in its stillness, a presence. Corthane noted the temperature drop. 23 degrees between the upper maintenance level and the lowest point they reached before Oswick stopped them at what appeared to be a solid wall, a section of original city foundation stone, unworked, running floor to ceiling without seam or fixture. Oswick pressed his hand flat against it at a specific point. A section swung inward, not a hidden door. The mechanism was too old for that kind of engineering, but a piece of stone balanced so precisely on its own mass that the right pressure at the right point displaced it on a pivot that had been functioning, apparently, for longer than the Imperium had known this world existed. Someone had found this long before them. The floor of the passage beyond was worn smooth, not by water, not by machinery, but by feet. Regular feet, over regular time, walking the same path with the same purpose. No dust. Corthane crouched and examined the floor with his lumen. The wear pattern was recent at the surface and ancient beneath, layer upon layer of passage, compressed into stone, the most recent layer barely distinguishable from the ones below it. People had been coming here since before the city was built above it. They were still coming here now. The passage opened after 30 meters into something that should not have existed. Corthane had been in underhive spaces before. Vast, vaulted caverns carved out by subsidence or deliberate excavation, industrial sumps, buried transit hubs from prior settlement phases. He understood large underground spaces. He understood the particular quality of stillness they carried, the way sound moved differently in them, the way the mind recalibrated scale. He was prepared for a large space. He was not prepared for a beautiful one. The chamber was cathedral scale, perhaps 40 meters high at its apex, perhaps 100 across, its ceiling lost in shadow that the lumens barely touched. The walls were original stone, the same mineral darkness as the passage, but worked here in a way the passage was not carved in the decorative sense, not ornamented, but shaped with a geometric precision that had required both extraordinary tools and extraordinary intention. The angles were not random. The proportions were not arbitrary. The chamber had been designed by something that understood geometry at a level of sophistication that made the Imperium's most accomplished architects look like children pressing their hands into wet clay. The forges above were not visible, but they were audible. A deep, rhythmic percussion that came down through 200 meters of stone and arrived in the chamber not as noise but as pressure, a regular pulse that you felt in the sternum rather than heard with the ears. The city's heartbeat conducted through the rock. Corthane became aware of it slowly, the way you become aware of your own pulse when the world goes quiet enough. Not a new sensation, but an old one you had stopped noticing, suddenly present again. The walls held two kinds of marking. The upper registers, the portions reachable by a human hand standing or climbing, were covered in human text. Generations of it, accumulated across centuries, etched into the stone in every variation of script and language that Gunmetal City's populations had used and forgotten and rediscovered across its history. Names, dates, prayers in High Gothic and Low Gothic, and two dialects Corthane didn't recognize. Declarations of faith, declarations of love. A child's name written 17 times by what appeared to be the same hand. The letters growing less steady with each repetition, as if the person writing had been shaking or weeping, or both. A complete passage from the Imperial Creed, rendered in script so small it must have taken hours, surrounded by other hands' additions until the original was almost illegible. People had been coming here to write on these walls for as long as there had been people in Gunmetal City. Coming here in secret since the level had no official existence. Coming here to leave something of themselves in a place that, by every institutional measure, did not exist. Corthane stood and read fragments for a long time, moving his lumen slowly across the accumulated testimony of thousands of ordinary lives, and felt something he hadn't expected to feel in this place. He felt grief. Below the human text, beneath it, older, carved into the original stone, at a depth that suggested tools of extraordinary hardness and precision, were the other markings. He almost missed them. The human text was dense enough, and the lumen's angle was shallow enough, that the deeper markings appeared at first to be simply the texture of the stone. It was Oswick who noticed them first, moving his lumen at a steeper angle and suddenly going very still. They were geometric, rigorously, uncompromisingly geometric, not the organic geometry of natural crystal formation, not the symbolic geometry of human or chaos iconography, but something that existed in a register between mathematics and language, sequences of intersecting forms, not decorative, not repeated in the way of a pattern, but developed, each section building on the previous with the incremental logic of a proof or a mechanism being described in stages. Corthane had studied Xenos iconography as part of his Arbites training. He had reference knowledge of Eldari script, Tau caste markings, Orc glyph systems, the cold angular designations of Necron territorial markers. These matched none of them. They did not feel like language exactly. They felt like instructions, specifications, the kind of marks an engineer leaves on a component to indicate its function and its tolerances and its relationship to the larger system it belongs to. He photographed every section within reach, working methodically around the chamber, while Oswick documented from the other side, and Cale stood near the entrance with his lumen pointed at the floor and said nothing. At the base of the oldest wall, the section where the original markings were densest, where the geometric sequences seemed to converge towards something that might have been a focal point or might have been a conclusion, were the offerings. Weapons. Only weapons, and only recently placed. The nearest still carrying the faint warmth memory of a human hand. Auto pistols. Blades of every manufacture from crude underhive work to fine forge master craft. Spent shell casings arranged in rows with a care that was almost tender. Decommissioned forge stamps. A laser gun with its power cell removed. A fragmentation grenade with its pin still seated, placed with the pin facing upward as if in presentation. All arranged with the deliberate spatial awareness of someone who understood that placement mattered. Not scattered, not abandoned, offered. The most recent offering was less than a week old. Corthane crouched over it, a combat blade, forge marked with a guild stamp he didn't yet recognize, laid flat with its edge facing the wall. He did not touch it. The listening place, Cale said. Corthane turned. The guide was still near the entrance, still looking at the floor, his voice carrying the quality of something recited. Not unwillingly, but automatically, the way prayers are recited by people who learned them before they were old enough to choose. Who calls it that? Everyone. Everyone in the Underhive. A pause. Everyone. Why? Cale looked up then. His eyes were steady and without apology, and carried something in them that Corthane would spend a long time afterward trying to classify. Not fear, not reverence, something that existed in the space between them. A feeling that had no clean name because it belonged to an experience that language had never been designed to describe. Because it listens, Cale said. He looked back at the floor. He did not say anything else. Corthane returned to the chamber's documentation. He was thorough. He was methodical. He cross-referenced his photographs against his notes, and his notes against his photographs, and when he had covered every accessible surface, he began on the floor, which was almost entirely worn smooth but retained. At the chamber's edges where foot traffic hadn't reached, faint traces of the same geometric markings, as if the original structure had been comprehensively inscribed, and only the most traveled surfaces had been worn to blankness over the millennia. It was in the far corner, at the chamber's deepest point from the entrance, that Oswick went quiet. Not the quiet of concentration, the specific quality of quiet that means a person has stopped what they were doing and become still in a way that doesn't feel like stillness. Corthane crossed the chamber. Oswick was standing with his lumen pointed at the base of the wall and not speaking, and Corthane came up beside him and saw what Oswick's lumen was illuminating and stopped moving. The man was sitting against the wall in the corner where the geometric markings were thickest, where they converged most densely, where the focal point or conclusion of whatever was inscribed here seemed to concentrate. He was sitting upright, composed, back straight, with the specific posture of someone who had chosen their position carefully. His uniform was Arbite's, a senior proctor's coat, the rank insignia still present, the fabric degraded by 6 months in a sealed underground chamber, but the structure of him still intact, preserved by the mineral cold and the dry, still air. His hands were in his lap. Across his hands, placed with the careful deliberation of an offering, edge facing the wall, in the same orientation as the combat blade Corthane had documented earlier, was a bolt pistol, standard Arbite's issue. The kind of weapon a senior proctor carries every day for 19 years until it stops feeling like a weapon and starts feeling like a part of the hand. Harren Voss, not dead in a way that suggested violence or collapse or the ending of something resisted, dead in the posture of arrival, of someone who had come to a specific place for a specific reason and completed what they came to do. His face, what remained of it, was turned toward the densest concentration of geometric markings, and if expression could survive 6 months in a sealed chamber, and perhaps it could, perhaps the cold preserved more than flesh, it was not an expression of fear. It was the expression the munitions press operator had described. The face of someone for whom, at the last, everything was exactly the right size. Corthane photographed everything. He documented the position, the orientation, the offering arrangement of the weapon, the precise location relative to the wall markings. He worked without speaking, and Oswick worked without speaking, and Kale stood at the entrance to the chamber and did not come further in. They began the ascent. Corthane went last, pausing at the chamber entrance to look back at the space, at the human text covering the reachable walls, the ancient geometric markings beneath, the offerings at the base of the oldest stone, the small composed figure in the far corner who had come to investigate a city and had found something at the bottom of it and had, in the end, placed his weapon down. He turned and followed the others into the passage. He was halfway back through the maintenance corridor, the worn stone of the passage giving way to pressed metal Imperial construction, the mineral cold receding as the forge heat crept back down from above, when he stopped walking. He had been hearing the forges since he arrived. The rhythm of them, that deep percussive pulse, had been a constant background presence so complete it had stopped registering as sound and became simply the texture of being in this city. He was hearing it now, in the narrow corridor, muffled by 200 meters of rock and city, but present, always present, the city's machinery doing what the city's machinery had always done. And beneath it, not louder, not sudden, not new, something he had been hearing since he arrived and had categorized, without examination, as part of the forge sound. A rhythm beneath the rhythm, slower, much slower, with a periodicity that had nothing to do with combustion cycles or press mechanisms or any industrial process he could name. Not mechanical, not random, not the settling of stone or the movement of groundwater or any geological process that produced regular sound. Regular, patient, old in a way that the forge sound was not old, in a way that the city above him was not old, in a way that the geometric markings on the chamber walls suggested without explaining. A regularity that predated the forges, that had been here before the first foundation stone was laid, that would be here after the last forge fire died. He stood in the corridor and listened to it and understood, with the cold clarity of a man who has followed evidence to its conclusion and arrived somewhere he cannot unknown, that the forges above him were not the source of the rhythm he had been hearing. The forges were the echo. Something beneath the city was the source, something in the stone. And the forges, 10,000 years of forges, generation after generation of hammers and fires, and the endless production of weapons, were not a response to human need or imperial demand. They were a response to this. They had always been a response to this. The city had not built forges because it needed to produce. The city had produced because something beneath it had needed to be answered. And weapons were the language of the answer. And 10,000 years of humanity living above this stone had learned, without ever being told, without ever understanding why, to keep speaking it. He stood very still for a long time. Then he continued up the corridor toward the light, toward the amber sky, toward the siege that was tightening around the city's outer edges like a fist finding its grip. His notes were comprehensive. His photographs were complete. His evidence was thorough and documented and sealed, and would mean he was beginning to understand absolutely nothing to anyone with the authority to act on it. He had the specific feeling of a man who has solved the problem he was sent to solve, and discovered that solving it was the least important thing that would happen to him here. Chapter 4. The city does not want to be saved. Corthane filed his preliminary findings at 0400 hours. By 0600, he had received 3 separate responses. The first was from the local Arbite's commander, a man named Sect, who Corthane had met once, briefly, on his second day. A large, careful man whose handshakes lasted exactly the right amount of time, and whose eyes, like Drail's, were always doing more work than his mouth. The commendation from Sect was warm and specific, praising Corthane's methodology, his thoroughness, his initiative in pursuing under-Hive access as part of a comprehensive assessment. It noted that the discovery of Arbitrator Voss's remains would be handled with appropriate solemnity, and that a recovery team would be dispatched. It said nothing about the chamber. It said nothing about the markings. It said nothing about the offerings or the rhythm or the 47 sieges with their impossible uniformity of duration. It praised what could be praised, and was silent about everything else with the precision of a document that had been very carefully written. The second response was from Magos Tertius Vrena, offering full Mechanicus cooperation with any further inquiries into the lower-level atmospheric and structural anomalies Corthane had documented. The language was technical, generous, and completely empty. Cooperation offered in a form that guaranteed nothing would be found, because the Mechanicus would be defining the parameters of the search. The third response had no sender identification. It carried an inquisitorial watermark. Not the full seal, not a formal designation, just the Aquila's shadow pressed into the header of the transmission like a thumbprint. The text was 4 words: "Stand down. It works." Corthane read those 4 words for a long time in the blue pre-dawn light of his billet. He read them the way you read something that has rearranged the furniture of everything you thought you understood. Now we are aware. Now this matter is classified. Stand down. Now you are in danger. Stand down. 4 words that assumed he already understood the situation and needed only to be reminded of the correct response to it. Stand down. It works. As if the question he had been asking, "What is this?" was not the question that mattered. As if the only question that had ever mattered, to whatever level of the Imperium had sent that watermark, was, does it function? And the answer, across 10,000 years of forges and sieges and weapons and the steady patient rhythm in the stone, was yes. It functioned. It had always functioned. The Imperium needed it to function. Therefore it was permitted to be what it was, and what it was would not be examined, and the people who came to examine it would be praised and commended and quietly absorbed until they either understood or became another offering in the listening place. He pocketed the data slate. He straightened his coat. He went to find Drail. He found him in the Enforcer command post on the mid-Hive tier, surrounded by siege coordination displays showing the outer defense perimeter's current status. 3 breach attempts in the last 8 hours, all repelled. The Orc forces massing at 2 points simultaneously, with a tactical patience that continued to unsettle the tactical assessors, who kept using words like coordinated and deliberate in their reports, with the careful hedging of people who knew what they were implying and were not ready to commit to it in writing. Drail received him without surprise. This, Corthane had stopped being surprised by. The way everyone in this city received him, always, without surprise. As if they knew before he arrived what he needed to say, and had already prepared the specific texture of response it required. "I need you to tell me what you know," Corthane said. He had decided, walking through the pre-dawn corridors, to stop framing his approach as investigation and start framing it as confrontation. Not aggressive, not accusatory, but direct in a way that left no room for the 12-minute explanations that answered everything and revealed nothing. Not what the official record says, not what the briefing says, what you know. Drayle looked at the siege displays for a moment. Then he turned and looked at Corthane with the expression of a man who has been waiting for a specific conversation for a long time and has made his peace with having it. The city has its customs, Drayle said. I've heard that. I know you have. A pause. They're not customs in the way you'd use the word. They're not traditions that people chose and maintained. They're responses. Things the city does because it has always done them. Things people do because the city has always needed them done. He was choosing his words with the care of someone navigating a path they know well but which has edges. The offerings in the lower level, the workers who sit and listen, the families who keep their positions for generations, the forges that run ahead of schedule when the external pressure increases. None of it was decided, none of it was organized. It simply is. The way the city is. Aaron Voss, Corthane said. The pause this time was longer. He found peace here. He placed his weapon down and died in the listening place. Yes. That isn't peace. That's surrender. Drayle looked at him steadily. Sometimes they're the same thing. He said it without cruelty, without defensiveness, with the flat evenness of a man reporting a fact he had long since finished having feelings about. He wasn't taken. He wasn't harmed. He went there because he needed to go there. And he stayed because staying made sense to him in a way that leaving no longer did. The city didn't do anything to him. A beat. The city doesn't do anything to anyone. It simply is what it is. And some people, when they understand what it is, find that continuing on the terms they arrived with becomes very difficult. And you, Corthane said, do you understand what it is? Drayle returned his gaze to the siege displays. I understand that it works, he said. I've stopped needing to understand more than that. Corthane left the command post. He walked. He walked for 2 hours through the mid-Hive corridors, through the transit tiers, through the production levels where the forges ran at full capacity, and the workers moved with their unhurried reflex efficiency, and the amber light came down through high grating and made everything the color of something preserved. He was thinking about the watermark, about those 4 words, about the level of the Imperium that had sent them, and what that level knew, and how long it had known it. He was thinking about the founding charters, 211 years before Imperial integration, a city that predated its own legitimacy in Imperial terms, a city that had been a city, with its guilds and its forges and its customs, before the Imperium had arrived to sanction it. What had the first Imperial administrators found when they came here? What had the first Mechanicus surveyors recorded in the reports that would later be revised and narrowed and eventually simplified into something that could be archived without discomfort? What had the first Arbites Proctor noted in their assessment, before the assessment was filed and commended and absorbed? He had been thinking of the watermark as a threat. He was now thinking of it as a confession. Stand down. It works. Not the language of concealment. Concealment would have been silence or misdirection, or the commendation that arrived with sect's response. This was something else. This was the language of an institution that had, at some point in its history, examined what it knew and made a calculation. That the cost of addressing it exceeded the cost of permitting it. That the weapons it produced were worth what it required. That the Imperium's survival was not a value that could afford too many questions about the nature of its foundations. He went to the archive. Not the Arbites archive, he had exhausted that. The Mechanicus archive, which he had access to through Vren's offered cooperation, access that had been given freely because it was access to a version of the records that had already been processed and presented and rendered safe. He used it anyway, because even processed records contained the shape of what had been removed, if you knew how to look. The gaps, the recalibrations, the sensitivity ranges that had been narrowed without authorization. He found the suppressed survey reports by their absence. Mechanicus archive protocol required that all survey reports, including superseded versions, be retained in a secondary classified layer, with access restricted to Magos rank and above. The secondary layer existed. He could see its designation in the archive index. He could not open it, but he could see how many documents it contained, and he could see the dates of the oldest entries. And the oldest entry was dated 300 years after the city's founding, which meant 300 years of surveys existed somewhere in an even deeper layer that the secondary archive itself had been structured to conceal. 300 years of surveys, conducted in the era before the founding charters were questioned, before the sensitivity ranges were narrowed, before the maps were updated to remove SB0. 300 years of records from a time when people who came to Gunmetal City still thought it was their job to understand it rather than to manage it. He could not read them. He could only know that they existed, and that they had been put somewhere that required significant institutional effort to keep them there. He returned to his billet. He found Oswick waiting outside his door. Oswick had a bag. Not a large bag, the bag of someone who had thought carefully about what they needed, and had decided to carry less than they wanted, rather than be slowed by more than was necessary. He had the look of a man who had made a decision in the night, and had spent the morning making sure it was still the right decision, and had concluded that it was, and was now, at the stage of acting, before he could reconsider. "I'm leaving," Oswick said. "There's a supply freighter on the transit pad, departing in 4 hours for the orbital station. From there I can find passage out of the system." He paused. "I've written everything down. Everything I have. 14 months of notes, the chamber documentation, all of it. I'm going to find somewhere outside the city's—" He searched for the word. "Gravity. And file it from there. From somewhere it can't be commended into silence." He looked at Corthane steadily. "Come with me." The corridor was quiet. The forge pulse came through the walls in its steady rhythm. Corthane stood and felt, for the first time since arriving in Gunmetal City, the genuine physical sensation of a door being held open, the warmth of the space beyond it, the specific relief of a way out presenting itself before the walls completed their closing. He thought about the watermark, about Drael's eyes always moving toward the lower levels, about Holt's 80 years of family records and the founding charters that predated legitimacy, about the munitions press operator's face when she said everything was exactly the right size, about Harren Voss, sitting composed in the dark with his weapon placed down, and the expression that might have been preserved in the cold. He thought about what he was, not what he felt, not what he feared, but what he was. The thing at the core of him that had survived 19 years of cases, and the Sump riots, and the Courier cartel, and the accumulated weight of everything the Imperium asked of its enforcers. He was an arbitrator. The law was the only instrument he had ever trusted, the only framework he had ever found that held when other things collapsed. He understood, standing in that corridor, that the law had no language for Gunmetal City, that it could not prosecute what was in the stone, or the rhythm, or the institutional memory of 10,000 years of managed complicity. He understood that the law here was cosmetic, had always been cosmetic, would remain cosmetic long after he was gone. He understood all of that, and the law still had to mean something. Because if it didn't mean something here, in the place where it was most completely inadequate, then it meant nothing anywhere. Not in the places where it worked, not in the cases where it held, not in any of the 19 years he had spent believing that the difference between order and chaos was the insistence that someone, somewhere, was paying attention. "I can't," Corthane said. Oswick looked at him for a long moment. Not with contempt, not with frustration, with the sorrow of a man who had hoped for a different answer and had not entirely expected one. "I know," Oswick said. He extended his hand. Corthane took it. The handshake lasted longer than was necessary, and neither of them moved to end it before it was ready to end. "I'll file from outside. Everything. Your documentation, mine, all of it. File it somewhere they can't commend it," Corthane said. "I'll find somewhere." Oswick picked up his bag. "I'll find the kind of inquisitor who uses the front door instead of a watermark." He walked down the corridor. Corthane watched him go, the specific sight of someone choosing the door that remained open, becoming smaller in the passage, becoming a shape, becoming gone. He went inside. He sat down. He opened a new case record file and began to write. Not a report for the relay, not an assessment for his chain of command, but a complete record. Everything from the beginning. The descent chronology, the chamber, the markings, the offerings, Voss, the siege durations, the founding charters, the narrowed sensitivity ranges, the secondary archive layer, Drail's words, the watermark, everything assembled in sequence, documented with the thoroughness of a man who understood that this document would not be acted on, and was writing it anyway because the act of documentation was itself the only form of resistance available to him. The insistence that the truth existed in writing somewhere, that it had been witnessed, that it could not be entirely absorbed. He wrote it for the next person they sent. He had been the next person once. There would be another. He wrote it for them. He was 3 hours into the document when the Transit Authority notification arrived on his Vox unit. A standard operational bulletin, automatically distributed, nothing flagged. All outbound vessels grounded for the duration of the siege emergency. Standard protocol, entirely legitimate. The supply freighter Oswick had planned to board was on the list. Corthane looked at the bulletin timestamp. He looked at it for a long time. The grounding order had been issued at 0200 hours, before the midshift, before Oswick had appeared at his door, before Oswick had made his decision. Made it in the night, he had said, and spent the morning confirming it, which meant the decision itself had been made sometime in the early hours, privately, told to no one. The grounding order existed 3 hours before Oswick had told Corthane he was leaving, before anyone in any official capacity could have known, before the decision had existed as anything other than a thought in one man's mind, in a room in the mid-hive of a city that was not, officially, paying attention to either of them. The city had already closed the door, not in response to Oswick's plan. The grounding order had come before the plan, which meant either the siege timing was a coincidence of extraordinary precision, or the city had not been responding to Oswick's decision at all. It had simply known. The way the forges knew to increase output when the atmospheric pressure changed. The way the workers knew to sit and listen when something moved in the stone below them. The way the city had always known, across 10,000 years, what was required and when it was required, and had adjusted accordingly, without being asked, without needing to decide, the way a body adjusts its temperature without the mind's instruction. The city had not closed the door to stop Oswick. The city had closed the door because the door was part of its function, and its function was always, in all things, to ensure that what was needed remained available. Corthane sat with that understanding for a long time. The forge pulse came through the walls. The amber light held. Somewhere outside, the siege continued its patient arithmetic, pressing against the outer defenses with a persistence that would last. He now understood why. between 14 and 17 months. Long enough to feed what needed feeding, not long enough to risk the source. He returned to his document. He wrote for another hour. When he finished the account of Oswic's departure and the grounding order, he added a section he titled, "On the Nature of the Institution." He wrote it carefully, without rage, without despair, in the measured tone of a man recording an observation rather than making an argument. The Imperium does not protect humanity from what is in this city. The Imperium requires what is in this city. This is not corruption. This is not failure. This is the Imperium functioning as it was designed to function, acquiring what it needs, managing what it cannot address, and ensuring that those who come close enough to understand the cost are given enough praise and enough isolation to prevent them from doing anything with the understanding. The watermark was not a threat. It was an orientation, a map of where I stand. I stand in a place the Imperium has already visited and assessed and decided to leave exactly as it found it. I am not fighting the city. I am not even fighting the institution. I am filing a report in a building the institution owns, on paper the institution provided, to be read by the institution when it chooses, if it chooses, and I will do it anyway. Because the alternative is to place my weapon down, and I am not ready to be that peaceful. He saved the document. He sealed it under triple encryption. He sat back and looked at the ceiling of his billet, at the pressed metal and the rivets and the faint amber glow that came through the ventilation grating from the forge-lit sky above. The city hummed. The siege pressed on. The rhythm in the stone continued its ancient patient count. Tomorrow he will go back down. Chapter 5. What compliant means. On the 31st day of the siege, the orcs breached the outer wall. For 6 hours, Gunmetal City bled. The breach point was in the western defensive arc, a section of wall that had stood for 4,000 years and came down in 40 minutes under sustained orc artillery that the tactical assessors later described, with the careful language of people unwilling to commit to what they were actually observing, as anomalously accurate for forces of this type. Through the breach came the first wave, not a tide, not a flood, but something more methodical than either. Orc forces pushing through in organized columns with a directional persistence that suggested they knew exactly where they were going and had been told, by something or someone, the most efficient route to get there. Corthane watched it from the mid-Hive command post's tactical display, standing at the back of the room while Drael and Sect and the guild commanders coordinated the response. He watched the breach icon pulse red on the display. He watched the counter-deployment indicators move to close it. He watched the city respond, again with that practiced, immediate, unhurried efficiency, as if the breach were not a crisis, but a procedure, something the city had done before and knew how to do and was, in some register he could feel but not prove, almost relieved to be doing. He was not watching the tactical display when it happened. He was watching Drael. At the moment the breach reports came in, at the exact moment the western wall's structural integrity alert sounded, Drael closed his eyes, not in distress, not in prayer. For approximately 3 seconds, Enforcer Captain Vascan Drael, commander of Mid-Hive Security, responsible for the lives of everyone in his sector, closed his eyes while his city was being breached, and something moved across his face that was not fear, and was not relief, and was not any emotion Corthane had a name for. Then his eyes opened, and he began issuing orders, and the moment was gone, and the room moved forward, and only Corthane had been watching the wrong thing at the right time. He left the command post. He walked to the nearest transit corridor viewport and looked out at the amber sky. To the west, the amber had changed. Deeper now, shot through with something redder, the forge smoke mixing with the smoke of breach warfare, to produce a color that had no precedent in the sky he had been watching for 31 days. The city's crown darkening, blooming. He stood and watched it, and listened through the viewport's thin metal to the city beneath him. The rhythm in the stone had doubled in speed. He had learned over 31 days to hear it beneath everything, beneath the forge pulse, beneath the transit noise, beneath the human sounds of a city conducting its daily function. It was always there. He had come to think of it the way you think of your own heartbeat, present, constant, below the threshold of conscious attention until the moment you needed to attend to it. It was below that threshold now. It was above it. It was faster than he had ever heard it, with a quality that was new. Not urgency, not alarm, but something he could only describe as satisfaction. The specific rhythm of a mechanism receiving exactly the input it was designed to receive. The city was feeding. The breach was not a wound. The breach was a meal. He descended for the last time. He had been down 4 times in 31 days, always with documentation purposes, always thorough, always adding to the record he was building. The chamber had become familiar to him in the way that places become familiar when you spend enough time in them to stop seeing their strangeness and start seeing their structure. He knew where the worn floor was smoothest. He knew which sections of human text were oldest. He knew the specific angle of lumen that made the geometric markings most legible. He had spent 31 days learning this space the way an arbitrator learns a case. Not to understand it exactly, but to know it well enough that he could describe it to someone who had never been here and have them see it. He carried 3 things: his lumen, his sealed document, copied onto 4 data crystals and stored in separate pockets, and his bolt pistol, which he had carried every day for 19 years, and which had become, as Drayle had once observed of Voss, less a weapon than a part of the hand. The passage was as he had left it. The chamber was as he had left it, with the additions of 31 days. 3 new offerings at the base of the wall, placed since his last visit, a new layer of human text in the upper register, including, he noted without surprise, his own name written once in a hand he didn't recognize. Someone had been watching him come and go. Someone had thought it mattered to record his presence here. He stood and looked at his name on the wall for a moment, surrounded by the names of 10,000 years of other people who had come to this place and needed to leave something of themselves in it. He understood the impulse. He did not act on it. The previous reports were where he had expected them. 3 of them, sealed in containers of different ages and materials, tucked into a natural recess at the base of the wall to the left of where Voss had been sitting. Voss himself was gone. The recovery team's sect had promised had come eventually and taken him out, and Corthane had received a formal notification that the remains had been processed with appropriate solemnity, and that the case of Arbitrator Harren Voss was considered closed. The recess where the reports sat was obscured by shadow and by the density of offerings accumulated in front of it, not hidden deliberately, but protected by accumulation, by the simple fact that nobody who came here with offerings was coming to look at anything else. He extracted them carefully. The oldest was in a metal case that had corroded almost to illegibility on the outside. He had to open it to find the date, and the date, when he found it, was stamped in a script style discontinued 4,000 years ago. The second was in a synth leather pouch, the material still flexible, the date placing it approximately 800 years back. The third was in a standard Arbite's evidence wallet. Modern materials, contemporary seals, the kind of wallet issued to field investigators across the Imperium. Its date was 60 years ago. 3 arbitrators before him had come to this place and left this. He sat against the wall opposite the markings and read them in order, oldest first, by the lumen's steady light. The oldest report was fragmentary, the language archaic, the investigative framework reflecting a period when the Arbite's approach to Xenos anomaly was less procedurally defined and more fundamentally confused. But the observations were the same: the markings, the offerings, the rhythm, the siege durations, the institutional management, the moment of understanding. The author, no name, just a rank designation that no longer existed in the Arbite's hierarchy, had written, at the end of a dense and increasingly agitated account, a single line that had been underlined 3 times. The city does not resist its enemies. It requires them. 800 years ago, someone had understood the same thing he had understood on day 31. The second report was more composed, the writing of someone who had arrived at the same conclusions, but had had longer, perhaps, to settle into them. It was thorough, well-organized, cross-referenced against guild records and Mechanicus survey data in ways that suggested the author had been here for a significant period of time. The final section was titled, in neat administratum script, Observations on the Pre-Imperial Structure, and contained the most detailed analysis of the geometric markings Corthane had found in any source. A painstaking attempt to decode the inscriptions through comparative analysis with every Xenos iconographic system the author had been able to access. The conclusion, after 40 pages of careful work, was that the markings did not constitute a language in any conventional sense. They constituted a specification. They described something in the way that engineering schematics describe something, not symbolically, not narratively, but functionally. What they specified, the author had been unable to determine entirely. But the word they returned to, repeatedly, in the conclusion's final paragraphs, was received. The structure beneath the city had been built as a receiver. It was designed to receive something. It had been receiving it through the medium of weapons and siege and the endless productive violence of the city above for longer than humanity had been on this planet. What it did with what it received, what it was, where it came from, what function it served in whatever system had placed it here, the author had not determined, had not perhaps been able to determine, had perhaps understood that some questions were not there to be answered, only to be asked in writing, so that the city could not pretend they had never occurred to anyone. The third report, 60 years old, was the shortest, 4 pages. The author identified themselves only as Proctor, attached to the Gunmetal City substation, temporary assignment. The observations were brisk, the documentation minimal. The tone of someone who had understood quickly and had decided, perhaps wisely, not to spend too long in understanding. But the final page contained something none of the others had. A passage that Corthane read twice, slowly, in the chamber's cold, still air, with the rhythm in the stone running its doubled speed above and below and through him. The passage read, "I have been trying to determine what the receiver is for. What is the purpose of a mechanism that requires 10,000 years of siege and weapons production to function? What is it building toward? I think the answer is that this is the wrong question. The receiver does not build toward anything. It simply receives. It is not a means to an end. It is a function, self-contained, purposeless in the teleological sense, as purposeless as a lung that breathes or a heart that beats. It does what it does because it was made to do it, and what it was made to do is simply to receive what is given, and to ensure, through whatever mechanism it uses to ensure things, that the giving continues. It is not malevolent. It does not want anything from us in the way that wanting implies desire. It uses us the way a fire uses fuel, not cruelly, not consciously, simply because that is what fires do and we are what is available. I find this more frightening than malevolence would be. Malevolence can be resisted. Malevolence has a face. This has no face. This is simply a property of the place. The way gravity is a property of mass. We built a city above it, and the city became part of its function, and the Imperium built its wars on the city's weapons, and the wars became part of its function. And 10,000 years later, here I am in the dark writing this down, which will also, I expect, become part of its function, because everything that happens here does. Corthane sat with that for a long time. He placed his 4 data crystals in the recess beside the 3 reports. He arranged them carefully, not randomly, not in a hurry, but with the deliberate spatial care of someone who understood that placement here mattered. Not because the receiver required it, because he required it. Because the act of placing his record alongside the others was the only form of continuity available to him. The only way to make his witness part of something larger than itself, to connect his 31 days to the 800 years, and the 4,000 years and all the unnamed days in between, to say, I was here, I saw this, I added my voice to the voices already here, and the city can commend me and absorb me and issue me a watermark, but it cannot unmake the fact that this record exists in this place, and the next person who comes will find it. He straightened Voss's absence, the outline on the stone where Voss had sat, the faint impression of a body that had been there long enough to leave its shape in the accumulated dust at the wall's base. He didn't know why he did this. He did it anyway. He sat for a while in the chamber, not in the posture of Voss, not facing the oldest stone, not with his weapon placed across his knees, sitting with his back against the opposite wall, facing the whole of it. The human text, the ancient markings, the offerings, the recess with its archive of witnesses, the space above where the forges ran their doubled rhythm, and the siege pressed its patient geometry against the outer walls. He sat and looked at it as a whole, and tried to see it the way the 60-year-old Proctor had suggested seeing it, not as a mystery to be solved, or a threat to be neutralized, but as a function, a property of the place, as natural in its context as weather. He found that he could almost do it. He found that there was a register of understanding available to him if he let himself reach for it, in which everything in this chamber made a kind of sense. The terrible, totalizing, perfectly coherent sense that the munitions press operator had described. The sense in which everything was exactly the right size. He could feel the edge of it from where he sat, the beginning of the gravity that had pulled Voss all the way down. He stood up. He picked up his lumen. He checked that his bolt pistol was holstered. He looked at the chamber one last time, at his name on the wall, written by a hand he would never identify, preserved in the same stone as 10,000 years of other names. And he turned and walked back through the passage. He climbed. The forge heat descended to meet him as he rose, and the mineral cold receded, and the rhythm in the stone settled back to its base frequency as the breach was contained, and the orcs fell back, and the western wall began its repair, and the city resumed, seamlessly, the function that a 6-hour interruption had barely slowed. By the time he reached the maintenance level, his coat smelled of forge smoke again, and the amber light was back in the ventilation grating, and the city was humming its steady, patient, 10,000-year hum. He went to the Arbite's substation. He sat at his assigned workstation. He opened his case record. He had spent 31 days building a document that detailed everything he had found, everything he had understood, everything the chamber contained, and the city was, and the Imperium had decided to accommodate. It was the most thorough piece of investigative documentation he had ever produced. It would be commended. It would be absorbed. It would be filed in a secondary archive layer behind a sensitivity range that nobody had authorized narrowing, and 40 years from now, someone would remove it from the official map, and the depth markers above and below it would connect cleanly, as if the space between them had never existed. He knew this. He filed it anyway. He filed it to the relay, to his chain of command, to every official channel available to him. Not because the channels would carry it to anyone who would act, but because the act of filing was itself the record, the timestamp, the proof that on this day, in this city, someone had looked at what was here and had refused to call it compliant. He opened his personal log. He had kept it since arriving. Not the case record, not the official documentation, but the private log that belonged to him alone, that carried his voice rather than his rank. He scrolled to the final entry and read the last line he had written 3 weeks ago, after the night with the siege duration data. The city is not defending itself. It is being fed. I don't yet know what it's hungry for. I think I will. He had been right. He knew now. He sat with the knowing. Then he opened a new entry in the log. He thought about what to write for a long time. Not because he didn't know what he wanted to say, but because he wanted to say it correctly. He wanted the sentence to be the right sentence, not the sentence of a man defeated, not the sentence of a man who had made peace with something that didn't deserve peace, not the sentence of a man who had sat down and placed his weapon across his knees. The sentence of a man who had seen the full size of what he was facing and had decided that seeing it clearly was itself a form of resistance, that the refusal to look away was the only thing the city, for all its 10,000 years and all its institutional gravity, could not require of him. He thought about the 60-year-old Proctor's final observation. Everything that happens here becomes part of its function. He thought about whether that was true of this, of the act of writing, of documenting, of the insistence on witness. He decided it didn't matter. The function of the receiver was not his responsibility. The function of a senior proctor was. He wrote one line. Who built the first forge? He locked the log. He pocketed it. He straightened his coat. He stood at his workstation for a moment, listening to the city, the forge pulse, the transit noise, the human sounds of 1,000,000 lives being lived above the stone, the rhythm beneath all of it, patient and old and unchanged by anything he had done or found or written or refused. He had approximately 12 months and 3 weeks remaining in the siege. He had work to do. The investigation was ongoing. The case was not closed. He stepped out of the substation into the amber hum of Gunmetal City, and the city closed around him like water and kept going. There's one thing worth saying about how this ends. Corthane doesn't win. He doesn't escape. He doesn't destroy the receiver or expose the conspiracy or find the inquisitor who uses the front door. He asks one question and goes back to work, and that is, structurally and emotionally, the correct ending. Because the horror of this story was never about whether the monster could be defeated. It was about the discovery that the monster is load-bearing, that the Imperium is built in part on top of it, that the law Corthane serves is real and insufficient, and worth serving anyway. That witness is not victory, and is also not nothing. The question he writes, who built the first forge, is unanswerable. He knows it's unanswerable. He asks it because the city has spent 10,000 years ensuring that nobody, in an official capacity, ever had to answer it. And the only thing left to do, when the walls are that complete, is to make sure the question exists in writing. That's what this story is about, and that's why it will linger.